I think what's so fascinating about this conference and this session is how a lot of these themes are weaving together. We've talked a lot about globalization, about being more interdependent, about being more self-reliant. We've talked about millennial values. I'm going to get into that and show you some examples of what I talk about in this new book called the Athena Doctrine. What it does is it looks at the rise of feminine skills and competencies in modern leadership. Now, all of it is based in data. Michael D'Antonio, my co-author, and I, we surveyed 64,000 people in 13 different countries. We tried to get a really wide swath of political, economic, religious, cultural diversity. So we gathered data from Canada to Chile, from Mexico to Indonesia. But the other thing we also did is we went out and we traveled the world, and we talked to innovative leaders. We spent 2 years basically documenting innovative leaders in NGOs, startups, Fortune 100 companies. This process took so long, I think I had hair when I started the project. But what we did is we went out and we asked people a lot of questions about life today, about what gives us our lives meaning. And there's a lot of pessimism at a macro level. People question whether their children will have a better life than their own. They also worry that there's too much power in the hands of large corporations. The other thing they're concerned about is this question of empathy. Do our leaders actually care about us more than they used to, of which 76% of people in 13 countries disagreed. And then this question about society's basic fairness. You know, are we set up in a world that's going to allow us to have an equal opportunity to succeed? And so with all these questions that were swirling, we started to get a deeper insight, and one of the things we saw was that there was sort of this global referendum on men. Now, the important thing about this, we asked this question, I'm dissatisfied with the conduct of men in my country. And literally 2/3 of people around the world, when you take out China and Canada, for some reason, Canadian men are doing something really well. So congratulations, Canada. But the point here, which is so interesting, is that Japanese men, South Korean men, there are men in a lot of these different countries that are frustrated with the conduct of men. And when we got deeper into this and unpacked the data, what we started to see is that they're frustrated with the structures, with the ways things have been done. And are there new opportunities for us to think differently? Now, what's also really fascinating is that millennials, young men and women, have a fundamentally stronger appreciation of women and their rights around the world. In fact, we saw double-digit generational gaps between young men and women and men over 50 in countries like Germany, South Korea, and India. In fact, we also asked this question, and 2/3 of people said the world would be a better place if men thought more like women. So I got really curious at these questions, and we went deeper into our research. Now, the big opportunity, or the obstacle rather, is that I'm obviously not a woman. Michael and I are both dads in all-female households, but that really isn't sort of high-quality empirical research. So what we did is we went back to our sample, and we asked 64,000 people to help us understand deeper about these concepts of gender and leadership. And the first thing we did is we divided the sample in half, and we asked 32,000 people to take 125 different human traits and just gender them, describe them as whether they're feminine, masculine, or neither. Now, what we did in the second half of the sample is we took those very same traits, but only this time there was no gendering. We basically said, tell us what are the qualities that we need for ideal modern leadership? What do we need to be successful and happy and to guide morality in our lives? And overall, we saw a lot of consistency around the world about what people thought was masculine and feminine, and this idea that these feminine values, these competencies that all of us have inside us, man or woman, they're on the ascendant. People think they're more important. So let's look at a couple brief examples. This is modeling the data. We started to see that the essence of the modern leader is more feminine. And what people are looking for is they're looking for leaders to be more expressive, to show their emotions, to really build out sort of their desires for how they connect with people, to not be tone deaf. They're also really looking for planning for the future. This emphasis of patience and long-term thinking to break through sort of political expediency and dig into problems to really build out sustainable solutions was something that we saw all over the world. Now, there are some masculine qualities that people thought were still really important, being decisive and being resilient. But look how far down aggression and pride is. And I think if you think about the themes that have been built up today, as Maria talked about earlier in the third metric, these ideas of aggression and pride, they're not getting everything done today. And so these ideas of being more flexible, more intuitive, more passionate, more collaborative, these were things that people thought were far more important. Why do we need that? It's because people believe that the world's been tilted a little too far in one direction. And in fact, we actually have to access all of these skills and traits if we're going to do a better job. The reason we need these things is that people realize we're in a social world. Collaboration is incredibly important, sharing credit. Our careers are tied to each other increasingly. And so is the concept of being open, being patient, being flexible, and by far being more honest. So what we're going to do is sort of look very briefly at these sort of 10 tenets that guide the Athena doctrine. These are sort of 10 competencies and skills that we saw were very important sort of levers of modern leadership today. The first example from one of the people that I met as I traveled around the world was this guy named Dr. Ayad Madish. And he's the founder of ResearchGate up the road in Berlin. And as I sat with Dr. Madish, he told me he kept getting stuck in his experiments at Harvard. And when he went around and asked his colleagues for help, they would say, well, why are you admitting you don't know something? You look a little ridiculous. You look foolish. Well, he was actually being vulnerable. He was being open and honest. But the other thing, as a scientist, he was being practical. He was trying to connect to other scientists. So he left Harvard, went to Berlin, and started ResearchGate. ResearchGate.org now has 2 million members from 200 different countries collaborating on 800,000 different papers. The other thing I think that's interesting about what Dr. Madish taught me is that we talk about this idea of learning from failure. It's a great male concept, right? Because you can kind of brush things under the rug and move on. What he was really saying is there'd be far less failing if we admitted what we don't know in the first place. Now, in the range of people we met the highest ranking woman in the Israeli Defense Force, Major General Orna Barbavai. I asked her how she approached military strategy, and she said from the perspective of a mother. She said a soldier needs to have a broader view than what they see looking through a gun sight. She also talked about how she rewards soldiers for de-escalating conflict at various checkpoints, including 2 of her daughters. Now, we also spent time in Reykjavik, and there, with the advent of the financial crisis, the level of trust in government was at an all-time low. So Constitutional Committee members got together using all the modern tools of social media and began crowdsourcing a new constitution. While it's yet to have been ratified, the simple concept of this inclusion coming together and working to guide something with this massive transparency around it was quite interesting. One of the countries I think that we were most intrigued by was Colombia. Colombia is a country that's in ascendance, and thankfully, in a large part, to activists like Catalina Coduque. She runs the My Blood Foundation. She and other women have helped repatriate 30,000 ex-rebel soldiers back into society. I mean, Colombia is just amazing. We met the head of the government services in Medellin. They have devoted 2/3 of their operating budget for the next 10 years to people under 30. Again, trying to break through systemic challenges and take things on in a new way. We also had a lot of fun one afternoon in the British countryside. We met Granny Holly, and she is one of the platoons of grandmothers that sew handcrafted goods for the startup Grannies Inc. Check it out, granniesinc.co.uk. But the awesome thing is, I described this business model as sort of a cross between Etsy and AARP. But what you have here are grannies that will sew handcrafted scarves and hats. What you do is you go onto the website, and the first thing you do is you pick out your own granny. So Granny Holly then hand knits that scarf. What I think is interesting about their business model, their tagline is, there's wisdom in the wool. So talking about legacy and empathy and connection. We also spent time in Kenya, remarkable country. You know, literally two-thirds of the entire Kenyan economy is now being driven by Robert Collimore's Safaricom and the M-Pesa text-based platform. But one of the things he's doing is he's using that technology to reduce corruption, to reduce extortion, and to connect NGOs and refugees using this incredible yet simple low-tech technology. Now, we also spent time in Sweden, and we met Maria Ziv, and she is the head of the Swedish Tourism Bureau. And she told me they did all their research around the world with people, and the top two things that come to mind about Sweden were blonde people and ABBA. So that's kind of a tough challenge if you're director of tourism bureau, because people think there's everything there is to know about Sweden. So they did something really bold. They went to the Swedish government and they got the official Swedish @Sweden Twitter handle for the country. Check it out. If you're on Twitter, follow @Sweden. What they did is they gave over that account to one citizen every week on behalf of the country to tweet. It's a big obligation, right? Now, one of the things that's happened is there's been some people that have said some things that haven't been very pleasant. Yet, rather than the government stepping in, ordinary citizens sort of retweeted these people back into submission. So interesting examples of transparency, incredible stories as we traveled around the world, 100 different innovators that we met that were thinking in different ways. Another great example is Sylvia Lally, and she is from the Women's House in Lima, Peru. There in Peru, domestic violence towards women was turned at one point with a very indifferent eye by the police. The police were also highly corrupt, and she got very upset by this, so she decided to create her own all-women's private police force. The reason she did this is that women weren't allowed into the police force. And through her efforts, she has now forced integration with women and men into the police force that has reduced corruption by nearly 30%. So again, tremendous courage, tremendous captivation as these people went on to these challenges. And perhaps maybe none more so than Eriko Yamaguchi. So Eriko is the founder of Mother House in Japan. And she designs handcrafted, high-quality handbags. And one of the stories she told me as I spent time with her is that she was bullied so badly as a child that her parents had to take her out of grade school. And so she started sketching when she was at home. And as she sketched, she started to realize she had a talent for fashion. But she also felt really empathetic toward people because of her own experiences. And she told me she went on to a website one day and typed in, "What is the poorest country in Asia?" and discovered that it was Bangladesh. Now, we all know what's happened in Bangladesh over the last several months. What she did is she went and created her own factory. She leased a factory, and the factory were all men. It was about 115 men. They were largely illiterate, and they had no idea how to make high-quality handbags. First thing she did, she raised their salaries by 50%. These guys, by the way, were basically making sacks for grains and potatoes. But she said, you know what, you guys need to believe in yourself, I believe in you. Second thing she did is she gave them name badges with their photos. They'd never had a photo of themselves before, most of them. So, trial and error, it took about nearly 18 months. She had some samples, and she took them to Tokyo. Now, fast forward 5 years later, she has 7 stores in Tokyo. She now pays double the wage average of workers in that sector in safe working conditions in Bangladesh. And with these 7 stores, in her own research, 2/3 of people do not know anything about her social value in her business. They just know that she makes high-quality handbags made in Bangladesh. So this is the power of these people that we met around the world. They're not accepting the status quo. There's a lot of emerging thinking here. These are a lot of millennial businesses, a lot of startups, a lot of NGOs, but there's some people that are being driven by technology, driven by values, and believing that there's a different way to think about leadership and about the world. And we go back to our data briefly. This is what we see. This is correlation, not causation, but we looked at our data against countries, and you can see largely that the more developed an economy, the more inclusive they are of feminine values and feminine competencies. Now, the other thing we see is the importance of quality of life. We did this report with Gallup in their World Happiness Index, and you can see that the more inclusive you are with these feminine values, again, the more quality of life that you have around the world. So I was enormously intrigued, excited, and really humbled by the experience I've had over the last 2 years devising and developing this book. What I've come to believe is that the best way to advocate for women and girls is to have men model their approach. We need to bring men into this discussion as partners, and we need to frame feminine values in a new way. Not simply about the differences between men and women, but the fact that we have these enormous abilities as leaders that we can frame feminine values as innovation, frame them as competitive advantage, and use them to thrive and prosper in the future. Now, all proceeds of our book support the United Nations Girl Up campaign, which is girlup.org. And if you get a chance to check them out and like them on Facebook, they are focusing on really driving and enabling the next generation of women leaders. And I spoke at their conference a couple weeks ago, and we were happy to have our first boy in attendance. So that's the future, and we hope it's far more brighter than it is today. So with that, I just want to turn this conference back over, and I thank you very much for your time and your support. We have a few books outside if anyone's interested in the book, and we are also devising leadership workshops for corporations to help them take the same test that we had in our study about ideal modern leadership and kind of see how your management team stacks up against what people want in a leader around the world. Thank you very much.